So, really what we're going to look at is, well, the history of how people, earnest people who have wanted to change hearts and minds, have used graphic imagery to alter the way the public views an injustice. And I think that by the end of the presentation, the use of graphic imagery will be much more understandable to you in terms of the why and the wherefore. That's really the whole goal, is to look at it and examine it and use the past as a means by which we can understand the present and, of course, understand, hopefully, the goal of the future in relationship to making abortion unthinkable. Goals determine strategy. This is Common Sense 101. And if you have a goal, and that goal is known to everyone, you're going to have a strategy in light of that goal. So in terms of pro-life activism, there are many fundamental and necessary goals. And sufficiently, we see that there are strategies in line with those goals. If I'm going to lobby politicians, or if I'm going to be involved in the political realm, I have that as my goal. I have different strategies, different plans, different tactics, different ways that I approach that, of course. If I'm providing care, such as at a crisis pregnancy center, or diapers, or instances where a woman is going through post-abortive needs in terms of working through that, all of those have different goals. They all have different strategies. If I'm teaching, if I'm educating, if I'm informing people, if I'm going to a church, or if I'm going to a school, I have that as the goal, to maybe give a pro-life presentation on apologetics, or as I did earlier, and how to sort of kickstart a conversation. That's a goal. I have a different strategy with that. Whoops, wrong button. What if my goal is to make abortion unthinkable? What will I use in terms of a strategy in light of that goal? Will I use the other strategies that are focused on different goals? We'll look at that. But what if the goal is to make abortion unthinkable? Know your goal, fundamentally, and really another fundamental feature of laying out strategy is to know your audience. Essential components. Goals and audiences go together. What do I mean? When you encounter different audiences at different places in the marketplace of ideas, you have to know where you're at in terms of what their thoughts are, where they're at in terms of whether they think abortion is something that's defensible or something that needs to be thought through. And as you look at the different audience members, I want you to think about that in relationship to abortion. Where are we going in the message that we want to have in terms of making abortion unthinkable? Oftentimes, we're very good at going to the choir. But I really want to stress the issue that the choir is essential. But we also have to look at the reality of the audience that's in the marketplace. The public opinion realm is an essential component of the goal that relates to making abortion unthinkable. The public is always reluctant to consider evidence of its own complicity in pervasive injustice. Effective activists must therefore confront the culture with evidence of culpability, which is unavoidable and indisputable. What do I mean by that? What's Gray Cunningham mean by that, my former boss? The idea is we're going to start looking at how past reformers have used graphic imagery to get people to think about things and to wrestle with things that they weren't going to wrestle with and they weren't going to think through on their own. That's the principal part of what we're going to look at. Social reform. It's essential, of course, to get to the definition. What is social reform? It's a change in both public sentiment and behavior regarding a societal injustice. If you have a change in sentiment, but you don't have a corresponding change in behavior, it's like faith without works. We want to have both tied together beautifully, and that's what social reform really is getting at. What is going to be a trigger by which people have a change in sentiment and therefore hopefully a change in behavior, their active participation in their society or culture? To change public sentiment. Inform and educate. We can use many different ways in which we inform and educate. You can use, as I'm doing right now, words spoken orally. You can use print sources. That's easy if you want to inform and educate, and that's your goal. And you can use the image. All of these taken, of course, from the civil rights movement. We have MLK delivering a speech in front of people. We have the fantastic letter that he wrote from Birmingham jail, communicating his arguments to the white clergy who had difficulty with his tactics, and he was expressing and explaining his strategy and the goals in relationship to that he felt they didn't understand at all. And then, of course, you have these iconic images that brought people to the streets that otherwise had no idea what was happening. So we have different ways in which we inform and we educate. But that's not exactly all in the picture. There is a way in which tension has to be created. Cognitive dissonance, a form of tension that we're going to see again and again and again in the history of social reform. There is education and information that has to be applied, but there also has to be tension. And I'll explain that in a little bit, how that works. Let me explain it real quickly here with images, but we'll look at the master in a little bit. You can use economic tension, a boycott. You can use one's physical ability to do work, labor, as a strike. And you can use your body in a sit-in or being sent to jail. And we see all these particular images again from the civil rights movement. Upper right-hand corner, we have a boycott. Of course, Rosa Parks, who would not move her body. That's creating tension. And of course, we have a strike from the Memphis sanitation workers on the lower right-hand corner communicating with their labor and creating tension in that. So when I talk about information and educating people as a means by which to engage social reform, which is what we all want, there has to be an element of tension. We'll see that again and again and again and again. So you see, from the perspective of Martin Luther King Jr., tension was a necessary component for getting people to have an altered sense relationship to the status quo, because the status quo is the enemy. If abortion is happening in this city, and if it's late-term abortion, that status quo needs to change. What will be the impetus by which that occurs? MLK, in many ways, is arguing for a necessary component, which is tension. Now, to both inform and create tension, the image of the injustice is the most immediate representation of the injustice. What do I mean? One of the ways in which abortion mills operate that makes them so successful is that it's behind closed doors. Closed clinical doors that they would have us believe are safe. The image brings the person who's never seen abortion into, as close as possible, the nuts and bolts, the nitty-gritty of that injustice. That is the reality of why the image speaks volumes. And when I say this, it may ring hollow, but the reality is what we're going to look at, the history of social reformers and what they have to say about the power and use of graphic imagery. Lewis Hine, if you're not familiar with that name, he's the individual who took the pictures of the children who were in textile mills and coal factories, and these images broke the back on child labor. So Lewis Hine recognizes the power of the image and bringing people to that reality. I'll start as chronologically as I can, and we'll go to the British slave trade in terms of how William Wilberforce use whatever was that means, in terms of there wasn't photography, but there was every means available in terms of actual physical things that could be brought into discussion or a gathering. This, though, was the Brooks diagram. And the Brooks diagram showed as graphically as they can the way in which Africans, like sardines, were put onto these trade ships. And these images were put into virtually as many places as they could on the walls, as you'd walk into a saloon or a bar or whatever the case may be, and people were horrified at these imagery. And we, being so distant many years from these types of images, we tend to think, well, did they really have that much power in the time? Well, let's see one scholar's perspective at how important this image was in creating both information and tension in the hearts of the people who did not want the status quo to continue. Instantaneous impression of horror upon all those who've seen it. And that's, again, what we're looking for, is bringing people onto the slave ship as close as possible as could be done. How many of you have seen the movie Amazing Grace, which looks at the biography, if you will, the life of William Wilberforce? He would bring down people actually to the harbor so that they could take in the aroma, if you will, the malodor of what these slave ships actually smelled like. And if you read some of the horrendous stories in relationship to what these people had to go through, I won't go into any details because they're very graphic, but that in itself, again, is another way to connect to the actual evil itself. Moving forward in the chronological study of the use of graphic imagery in the history of effective social reform, we have American slavery. And this image that I'm going to show you is iconic. Many of you have seen it, perhaps. Raise your hands if you have. Okay? There is a whole story behind this slave, how his back got that way. And we look at this image. Those of us who have seen it before. One of my jobs is to connect us to this image and how powerful this image was in the time, and how we can learn from that in the present and the future in relationship to this injustice. So here's this next quote. It's very important to connect up this picture with what they wanted to do. So they believe this photograph should be multiplied 100,000 times so that people can see it. And we run into this problem within the pro-life community largely in relationship to whether or not we should use the imagery at all. Not just in specific certain points in which there can be an agreement by which we disagree, but this is looking at it in terms of the large, wide, open expanse, people seeing it in the public opinion realm. Child labor. Again, I mentioned Lewis Hine. I have this book. It's over there with my boys. But they have a whole series of these books. And if you read the subtitle, How a Photograph Helped End Child Labor. One day, if we could imagine a photograph of an aborted baby, and underneath it, how an image of abortion helped end abortion. The reality is, these types of photographs help people to see where they got cheap textiles, where they got the cheap coal from. The status quo is unacceptable. But are we willing enough to create the needed tension in order to bring people to have a change of sentiment and a change of behavior? That is the key. And I think these social reformers are saying continuously, you have to have both together. Within America, we pride ourselves as a country of individuals and of choice, right? Strong, rugged individualism. So when they paint us as being anti-choice, they've done a great marketing job from day one. We want to be able to control the narrative by showing what choice looks like. So again, this author is saying the exact same thing as we've seen before. These images are bringing people into, as close as possible, the textile mill, into the coal mining affairs, so that they can see the reality of what's happening to these kids. This is another iconic image. We propose to make you and the whole country so sick and tired of the whole business that when the time for action comes, child labor pictures will be records of the past. And we want that in relationship to abortion. Lewis Hine was willing to make people upset, to create the tension necessary and needed by which the status quo was altered. Are we willing to make people so sick and tired of abortion that, you know what people say, I'm willing to not vote this person into office anymore? That's what we want. We want to make people so sick and tired. And when we use the word abortion in a conversation, we have to watch ourselves, because we may be talking over one another's heads. They may be thinking abortion as a blob of tissue. Oftentimes that's how people look at it, of course. We're talking about it in a very different light. The imagery builds common ground. That's what I've found over the years. The imagery builds common ground. And forward into the Holocaust. Now we're entering a realm where most people have seen imagery in relationship to what happened in Germany and Poland. But there is a lot of sub-information that's fascinating in relationship to what happened and how people have treated this particular event. Notice these people are being forced to look at the reality of a concentration camp. And noticing they're all looking away. It's a natural impulse to not look at something grotesque, of course. Interesting quote from General Eisenhower in relationship to when they first started to come upon these death camps. That's a whole other thing. To use the word concentration camp is a brilliant euphemism by Nazi Germany. And there's much written about that they had a fetish for using euphemisms, much like Planned Parenthood. It'd be much more accurate to call it a death camp. A concentration camp sounds where people are trying to study for a finals, right? But a death camp is a much more accurate portrayal of what happened. So language is an essential component for controlling the narrative. And we cannot let them control the narrative. They have much more money, and they have ability to pay people to plan and market this. So we have to be able to go right to where they don't want it to happen, and that's seeing the imagery. And I would agree with Eisenhower in relationship to abortion is beyond the American mind to comprehend. I have to first admit that to my own mind, and I have to be able to admit it to the people who are around me, that it is really truly beyond the human mind, the American mind to comprehend. A little bit of background on some other information related to the Holocaust. How many of you have seen the movie Schindler's List? Okay, Steven Spielberg. Steven Spielberg made it an essential component of this film that he paid for a copy to be in every single high school. He understood the power of getting that movie, which depicted very horrifically certain aspects of the death camps. He made it sure